We have no conclusive, convincing evidence that narcissism, pathological narcissism, is the outcome of genetic transmission, that there is a hereditary component in pathological narcissism, although it stands to reason. It makes sense. Also, at this stage, we have no convincing studies that demonstrate brain abnormalities in narcissism. So, we are forced to stick to what we have learned over the last 130 years, that in the background of every narcissist, there is some problem with upbringing, with child rearing, with parenting, some kind of dysfunctional family. Now, we use the words abuse and trauma, but we should use them cautiously, and we should expand the definition of abuse. Anything that breaches the child's boundaries, anything that prevents the child from separating and individuating, anything that doesn't let the child walk away from the parent and become their own person, should be construed as abusive and traumatizing. So parents who pamper and spoil are equally as bad as parents who neglect and reject and physically abuse. Today I would like to discuss 4 theories of the psychogenesis, the etiology of pathological narcissism. What makes a narcissist? What transforms the child, innocent and happy as it is, into a brooding narcissist in later life? Now, there's about a zillion theories, and I'm going to cover many of them in future video. For example, one of my future videos will deal with social investment, the social investment model of trait development, and so on. But today I would like to focus on 4 psychodynamic theories that have been proven, actually, have been substantiated by multiple studies and experiments in the past 20 years. It's pretty amazing because the people who came up with these theories had no access and no wish, maybe, no willingness to engage in actual experimentation, actual studies, actual field work. And yet, their insights, their ideas have proven to be unerringly, one could even say eerily, true. And today, I'm going to cover these 4 points of view. What makes a narcissist? What converts and transforms a child into one? My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. I'm also a professor of psychology. Narcissistic parents subvert the child's ability to separate from them, the separation individuation phase. They don't let the child walk away in a variety of ways. And one of the main reasons is that narcissistic parents are incapable of telling the difference between internal objects and external objects. The child should be treated as an external object, and yet the parent perceives the child as nothing more than a figment of the parent's mind, a kind of furniture or prop, an extension in the best case. So it is an internal object. Letting the child walk away, letting the child separate, letting the child set nascent boundaries, letting the child individuate, become an individual, divided from the parent, that's very threatening to a narcissistic parent because it's an internal object. It's as if the narcissistic parent is required to give up a piece of her or his mind. And that's terrifying. It's anxiogenic. It creates anxiety. So the parent clings on to the child, envelopes the child, engulfs the child, refuses to let the child walk away. And again, we are not talking only about indulgent, overprotective parent. When you abuse the child physically and sexually and so on and so forth, you are merging with the child. You're fusing with the child. You're instrumentalizing and objectifying the child. And of course, you're not letting the child become separate from you, an individual, a person. You're not allowing the child to develop a self or personhood. The 1970s saw a flurry of theorizing on what creates narcissism in otherwise perfectly healthy children. How does this transmutation come about? What renders a child joyful, curious, happy? What renders such a child suddenly divorced from itself, antagonistic, withdrawn, and subject to the whims and vicissitudes of a divinity, a new divinity, the false self? What generates and engenders this incredible process of psychopathology, psychogenic process? So, start with Kohut, Heinz Kohut, 1977. Kohut suggested that in the development of a child, there are two primary dimensions, two primary aspects. One is grandiose exhibitionism, and one is idealization. Obviously, a child who is 18 months old, or 2 years old, or 3 years old, needs to develop some kind of grandiosity in order to take on the world, in order to observe, in order to explore, in order to interact with peers. This kind of child needs to develop a God-like sensation, a feeling that it is God-like. And similarly, the child needs to observe adults and convert them in his mind into role models. He needs to idealize initially his parents, and more specifically his mother, in order to somehow internalize them and render them an integral part of a developing self. Grandiose exhibitionism requires parental empathic mirroring. The parents should mirror the grandiosity to the child by encouraging the child to walk away, to separate, to explore, to discover, to interact, to experience loss and failure and pain and hurt. Grandiosity is the key to the world out there, the absolute precondition for object relations later on in life, and parents should empathize with the child, should not put the child down, criticize the child, mock the child, ridicule the child, and humiliate the child, but should actually encourage the child by mirroring. And idealization requires the appropriate behavior. Behavioral role modeling requires a model, so the parents should act the way they want their child to be brought up and act later in life. If the parents do not want the child to lie, they should not lie. If the parents do not want the child to be hypocritical, nor should they be. If the parents want the child to be a just and empathic person, they should act justly and be empathic. And the child would emulate and imitate all this. This is called social learning theory, social cognitive learning theory, and I have a video dedicated to it in the CU playlist. Consistent parental support, however, should not become a form of overprotectiveness, stifling monitoring, and some kind of super indulgence, pampering, spoiling, pedestalizing, idolizing. It should not go there. Consistent parental support means that the parents are there as a secure base, as a safe background, as a launching base from which the child emerges and to which the child returns, having harvested information about the environment, new knowledge, and having experienced good and bad things. The parents should always be there at the ready to absorb the child, ready to help the child process, ready to allow the child to develop without fear of punitive measures. So, at the same time, the parental support should be atmospheric, ambient, and it should alternate with specific, intermittent, and non-traumatic optimal frustrations. Periods however limited, a few minutes, a few hours, in which there's no parental guidance, no affirmation, and sometimes not even presence. These optimal frustrations, these mini frustrations, modulate the child's grandiosity and then convert it into self-confidence. These mini frustrations render the child, help the child to become grounded in reality, and they also aid in the internalization of parental ideals. The mini frustrations, in other words, help the child to develop reality testing. Gradually, the child is able to get rid of the splitting defense. My parents are all good, I'm all bad, or vice versa, and begin to see the parents in a nuanced, much more realistic light. In other words, these mini frustrations eliminate grandiosity, help to create a realistic image of the parents, which makes it much easier to internalize them and to emulate and imitate them. These mini frustrations are super critical. Overparenting and permissiveness, over-responsiveness, indulgence. In other words, parents who refuse or afraid to frustrate the child. Parents who do not mitigate the child's nascent grandiose self. Parents who do not allow the child to separate from them. These are bad parents, essentially abusive parents, because they, by behaving this way, by isolating the child in a bubble of their own making, they don't allow the child to develop a self, to differentiate, to explore reality, to shape itself and adapt, and to be prepared for life later on as an adult. On the other hand, at the other pole of the spectrum, under-parenting, non-responsive, or rejecting parents, they cannot be internalized. They cannot be idealized. The child cannot idealize such parents because he feels the lack of love, the absence of empathy, and the ambient implicit rejection. So he cannot idealize these parents. He cannot internalize them. And without internalized, idealized objects, there's no self. And so, again, there's a problem with the formation of the self. Henceforth, this kind of child depends crucially and always on interpersonal feedback in order to somehow stabilize the precarious, fragile pseudo-self, kaleidoscopic self that takes the place of a fully integrated, cohesive, and constellated self. The self of such a child is not functional because it misses crucial elements, most notably internalized, idealized, loving parents. No self-love, no love of others, no object relations. This is Kohut. Kernberg in 1975, 2 years prior to Kohut, suggested a completely different picture. He said that parental coldness, strictness, hostility, harshness, unloving, covertly aggressive parents, they cause defensive reactions in the child. And these defensive reactions inhibit the formation of a fully functional, healthy self. And the outcome is a pathological organization of the self. The beliefs about the self are totally biased and skewed and defective, deformed and counterfactual. The ideal self, the idealized image of the self, is defunct and problematic. And there's no ideal object, there's no idealized image of the parents. There is no ideal object to internalize. So there's no stable core of self-regard. It is through the parent's gaze that initially the child learns to love itself, to regard itself positively. Narcissistic children, as Kernberg put it, and I'm quoting, often occupy a pivotal point in their family structure, such as being the only child, or the only brilliant child, or the one who is supposed to fulfill the family's aspirations. And such expectations, that's end quote, and such expectations foster a chronic need for some kind of refuge, some kind of escape, some kind of sanctuary. So the child runs away from, flees the scene of this kind of parents who are constantly demanding, and harshly so, and are very punitive if their expectations and demands are not met. And the child's refuge is the false self, this sense of superiority and lifelong inflated illusory worth. Kernberg's formula is parental coldness plus extremely high expectations plus harsh demands equal a narcissistic self. Onward to the object relation schools which preceded even Kernberg. Most of them worked in the 1960s in Britain, of all places. We're talking about Winnicott, Guntrip, Fairbairn, and others. According to object relation schools, narcissism is a result of the parent's strategic use of the child. The parent uses the child to fulfill their own ambitions, realize their own unfulfilled dreams and fantasies. The child is instrumentalized, becomes a tool in the armory of the parent. The parent uses the child to self-regulate. The child becomes a source of external regulation of the parent. Rothschild, in 1979, injected a motivational component. He said that parental behavior is driven by two, sometimes competing, motivational systems. The self-focused system, with the question, how does my child meet my needs? And the child-focused system, how am I meeting my child's needs? And so he said that empathic parents, functional, good enough parents, whatever, empathic systems, they tip towards the child-focused. An empathic system, a correct form of parenting, is child-focused, not selfish, not self-focused. Emphasis on self-focus, said Rothschild, leads to a narcissistic child. In self-focus, the parental investment is conditioned on the child's performance. Affection, compassion, empathy, and of course, love is contingent, is conditional. The child must meet certain parental standards and expectations, or otherwise the child is denied all access to the meaningful access, emotional, affective access to the parent. The child's narcissism is a defensive response or a fixation. The parent is objectifying, and the child aims to cater to the parent's emotional needs, and in this whole process, the nurturance of the child is abandoned and neglected and overlooked. Karen Horney wrote in 1939, decades before all this, I'm quoting, parents who transfer their own ambitions to the child develop in the child the feeling that he is loved for imaginary qualities rather than for his true self. And because of that, the child discards the true self in favor of a parent-flavored, a parent-like, a parentoid, idealized false self. Mind you, the real parent is not available to be idealized, so the child creates a fictitious, imaginary parental figure, which can be idealized, and is idealized, and becomes the false self. The narcissistic self is a manifestation of the attempt to seek approval from this idealized object and from idealized objects in general, which is exactly why the narcissist idealizes you at the inception of a relationship, romantic or otherwise. On to Milon in 1981. Milon came up with the idea of social learning, actually, preceded Bandura by a few years. And he said that children learn about themselves and about others. Children mentalize others. And they do this by observing their parents' behaviors. Permissive, indulgent parents, parents who set very few rules, limitations, and boundaries, they teach the child that it is superior, that it is entitled. And this is what Milon had to say. Children that have been exposed repeatedly to acquiescent and indulgent parents will expect comparable treatment from others, and they learn to employ the presumptuous and demanding strategies that quickly elicit favored reactions from their parents, quickly elicited favored reactions from their parents. So these children use the strategies that worked with their parents with other people later in life. And of course, it leads to dysfunctional relationships, resentment. The narcissist who uses these strategies, the narcissist who feels entitled and who expects other people to indulge him, to acquiesce in his abuse and mistreatment and lack of empathy and so on, this kind of narcissist is likely to be badly disappointed. And such parental behaviors, these parental behaviors, model for the child. And the message of the modeling is, other people are beneath you, my child. Other people are weak and contemptible and manipulable. And the child learns. The child manipulates his own parents or her own parents. The parents cater to the child's every whim and temper tantrum. This kind of child learns that people, as I just said, are inferior, they're weak, they're easily manipulable, can be manipulated. Child becomes Machiavellian, and this set of beliefs, they form the child's interpersonal core, internal working model, highly narcissistic one. The parent's boundless, worshipful adoration is information. It's a form of signaling. The child uses this information, this data, to construct a narcissistic view of both himself as superior, godlike, and others as servitude, people who are doomed to servitude because of their innate, inherent inferiority. Most theories of parenting describe several dimensions: warmth, monitoring, and psychological control. Studies have used this dimensional approach and constructed tests and experiments. And these tests and experiments in the past 30 years, or 25 years, have proven pretty conclusively that Kohut's insights, Kernberg's insights, Milon's insights, and the insights of object relation schools are all absolutely correct. Shockingly, the intuition of these people, which was not based on any evidence, has proven to be true. So the parenting dimensions include warmth, monitoring, and psychological control. Warmth is the emotional and material support, the nurturance, the involvement, the acceptance, the child-centeredness, and the responsiveness that the child expects and deserves, and that make the child a healthy adult individual. Monitoring is keeping track of the child's whereabouts, actions, and social circle. And psychological control involves intrusive actions, guilt-tripping, manipulation, sometimes via the withdrawal of love, possessiveness, overprotectiveness, disappointment and shame in the child, and even spoiling, pampering, pedestalizing, and idolizing the child, instrumentalizing the child to realize the parents' fantasies and dreams, unfulfilled as they are, and parentifying the child, rendering the child the parent's parent. Parenting styles were described by Baumrind in 1971. Baumrind, B-A-U-M-R-I-N-D, 1971. He suggested three: authoritative parenting style, which is high on warmth, high on monitoring, and low on psychological control. Authoritarian parenting style, low on warmth, high on monitoring, high on psychological control. Permissive parenting style, which is high on warmth, but low on monitoring and low on psychological control. And Macoby and Martin in 1983 added the neglectful parenting style. Everything low, warmth is low, monitoring is low, psychological control is low. In other words, the parent is completely uninterested in the child. It's a form of absentee parenting, reminiscent of Andre Green's dead mother. These four theories that I've presented to you, these 4 points of view on how a narcissist is made today, are substantiated by research. And we believe that these are the pathways, the developmental pathways, that result in pathological narcissism in the child, initially as an adolescent, but much later as an adult. However, there are other theories, and they're being tested as we speak. And I will give you an overview of these theories later on this channel. I'm also going to delve deep into the parental involvement, not only in the formation and maintenance of pathological narcissism, but in the metaphorical narrative that underlies narcissism and the child's life later as an adult.